Restaurant Unstoppable, episode 714 with Eric Bernheim. With excitement, allow me to introduce to you today's guest, Eric Bernheim. Eric, my man, are you feeling unstoppable today?
I am. I'm ready to lead our clients to the best path forward.
Yes, awesome. So Eric Bernheim is a partner at Halloran Sage law firm where he skillfully leads his clients through complex real estate transactions. His practice includes transactional work, zoning, land use, and commercial leasing matters, focusing on representing restaurant operators interested in expanding throughout the country. With over a decade of experience, Eric's solid understanding of commercial and residential real estate matters provide his clients with peace of mind and confidence. Today, we're going to be talking about the 9 strategies to resolve landlord-tenant relations. So obviously, this is a hot topic right now because of what's going out there with COVID-19. But the cool thing is, I think we can use these lessons from now and going into the future. Like, these are lessons that are not just relative to right now, but after COVID-19, when things pick back up, these are lessons we'll be able to apply in our business even then, right? Safe to say?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think anybody who makes it through this, any restaurant group that makes it through this crisis is going to have a strong relationship with their landlord. And hopefully those partnerships will continue to thrive into the future. You make it through this, you're going to be able to make it through anything.
Nice. So before we get into those 9 strategies to resolve landlord-tenant relations, let's get that motivational, inspirational ball rolling with a success quote or mantra. What do you got for us?
Our firm, we really try to gear ourselves towards leading our clients down the best path forward. In this situation with COVID-19 out there, there's no playbook out there for what we're dealing with. And there's no right or wrong answers. We just all need to take the best path for ourselves and for our businesses and our partners. And those partners include our landlords when we're dealing with restaurant tenants.
Yeah. And it's just like right now, like this mentality of togetherness has never been more relative, more important. And just the idea of sharing knowledge, I think, is the right path, and understanding that nobody knows, right? And that we're all in this shitstorm together is key. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, everybody being in this together is key. Communication is also key. The landlords and the tenants really need to be communicating almost on a daily basis to try to get through this pandemic. Landlords also need to be communicating with their lenders and vendors as well to try to pass along some relief to their tenants. And the restaurant operators need to do the same. Anywhere where you can get relief from your financial obligations, you need to start pursuing those avenues as soon as possible so that you can try to make it through this.
Awesome. So one thing I like to do whenever I have an authority on the show, an expert like yourself, I want to get to know that person. So tell us a little bit more about you, what got you into law, and specifically, I'm curious about why restaurants, why commercial real estate, why that vertical?
Sure. So I got into law because I've always really liked to help people. And when I was in undergraduate, I was a marketing major, and I wasn't really feeling it. It wasn't making me satisfied. And I took some law classes, and I felt like it was really interesting. And the cases I was reading was really, one thing was common. The lawyers were always trying to help their clients out. And because I enjoyed helping people get them through tough times, good times and bad times, it seemed like a good fit for me. So I took the plunge and went to law school, and I really couldn't be happier. I enjoyed interacting with my clients, helping them with their issues, living alongside them, good times and bad, and fortunately for me, I've represented a lot of great restaurant groups that have expanded a great deal over the last decade or so, and have aggressive growth models, and it's been great for them. It's been great for me. But unfortunately, right now, times are really tough. So now is where we have to kind of put our A game on and really try to help them through
Mm-hmm.
this crisis so that we can get back to what we do best, and allow them to serve their customers and continue to grow.
Now, you mentioned something before the recording that really resonated with me. And you said one of the things that brought you or drew you, attracted you to law is helping people solve their problems. And really, that's all you're doing is just people are coming to you with their problems, asking you for help. And I love that mentality of solving problems. That's really what an entrepreneur is, right? Like, you're out there, or a leader, as a leader, your job is just to solve problems for your team, to exist, to solve problems, to make your team stronger, to empower your team. And I love that mentality of solving problems. Any reflection on that before we start to dive into the core content today?
Yeah, it really just requires a lot of creative problem solving. I primarily what I do for my restaurant group clients is negotiate their leases and help them through that process. And then once they have a signed lease, when they have issues with their landlord, a lot of times I'm helping to resolve those also. And I tell you a quick story. One of my best clients, he was on an airplane, reviewing his lease and handwriting in his comments while it was a choppy flight. And he got back and he handed it over to me when we were meeting at his office and said, "I hope you can read my writing." And I responded to him. I said, "It's really, whether I can read it or not, we've been doing this for almost a decade now. I know everything that you want." And it, so the tricky part comes into when landlords are trying to negotiate those terms with us, and they're not always comfortable with it. So the 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 art of it is protecting the restaurateur while also giving the landlord the protection that they are desire as well. And quite frankly, a lot of landlords that push back on a lot of our provisions that we get into our leases, they fight with us quite a bit during the negotiation phase. However, they should take some solace in the fact that my operators, they know what they need in order to be successful. And the last thing a landlord wants is for an operator to just say yes to whatever lease is sent over to them, and then they get into the term and they fail because they don't know what they're doing. So a lot of our provisions that we fight really hard for in our leases are integral to good operators being able to do their job. And at the end of the day, our job is to be successful and pay our rent. Landlord's job is to be a good landlord and provide what they're required to under the lease as well. But if they don't have a good operator in there, then they're going to be looking for another tenant in the short term.
Yeah, awesome stuff. I think we have a pretty good idea of who you are now. Thank you for that. So, before we really just dive into those 9 things, those 9 strategies, those 9 solutions for landlord-tenant relations, let's just talk about the scenario. Like I think it's really important just to kind of break down the reality of the situation. Like, we've never seen this before. No one's at fault. So what are you seeing? Like, take us through the state of the industry from a lawyer perspective who specializes in real estate in the restaurant industry. Like, what's your perspective?
Sure. So when we first saw the writing on the wall that that most of the restaurants across the country were going to be shut down, my clients were calling me nonstop. And I'd say I have, for the most part, 3 primary restaurant groups that I work with that I do most of my leasing with. And I was on the phone with their CEOs pretty regularly for the first week or 2 before all of the restaurants got shut down. And what we were working on was an initial letter to the landlords asking for help, essentially telling them that we saw what was coming. It was just a matter of time before our revenues were going to drop astronomically, and we needed some relief from rent. And it wasn't, and we made some proposals, and we didn't expect the landlords to accept those proposals and not push back, but we wanted to start the conversation. And in my opinion, communication is key. If we had chosen just not to pay rent, then the landlords are going to respond and say, well, they didn't even call me. And same thing where a landlord doesn't even pick up the phone and call my clients after they receive this letter, and instead they just respond with a notice of default. That doesn't make my clients want to help that landlord out at all. So really, communication, understanding each other's issues and concerns, and trying to work through those so that everybody can live up to their end of the bargain as much as possible during this crisis, these unprecedented times.
Yeah. And at this point, I hope you've made contact. Like 2 months into this thing, I hope you guys are communicating with your landlords. But I think it's important to point out that just because you made contact doesn't mean you don't have to continue to communicate. It's an, I think it's important to keep that line of communication going. So what, after you've made contact, maybe this is kind of what today's conversation is going to be like, what that conversation looks like going forward, perhaps, any other thoughts, any other feelings that you want to get out there before we really start to like dissect these 9 ways to communicate or strategies around communication or planning for the future?
Sorry, I'm just taking a note so I don't forget to say something down the road. Yeah, I think communication is absolutely key. Right now, you're not paying rent, but once you are allowed to reopen, there's probably going to be a lot of restrictions. I know in Connecticut, they're talking about May 20th, restaurants can start opening, but they're only going to be allowed to open outside for service on patios and the such. So restaurateurs should really be reaching out to their landlords. Is there more common area space that they can now utilize that's not really a part of their patio? Are the local municipal zoning regulations going to allow for expanded patios? Is the state liquor control going to allow for liquor sales outside of your stated patio area that you currently have that's fenced off? All of these things you want to get ahead of. If you wait until you get permission to go outside and you're stuck with a small 800, 1,000 square foot patio when there's maybe 5,000 or 6,000 square feet of usable space that with the lack of foot traffic a landlord may allow you to use, the landlord may say yes, but the town may say no, or the state liquor control may say no. So you really want to be ahead of the curve and start having these conversations as soon as possible.
Beautiful. So let's just get right into this. The first strategy to resolve your landlord-tenant relationship through this pandemic, number 1 is, can you pay? If you can, pay. Right? Kind of seems obvious, but just because some other restaurants are floundering and maybe not surviving, that doesn't give you like an excuse not to pay your rent. You want to break that down a little bit more? I mean, it seems pretty obvious.
Sure. One of my litigation partners always says to me, how come the landlord's always the first one to get hit with, I can't pay you? And I don't necessarily agree with that statement, but yes, most conversations with my clients starts off with, if I don't pay, can they throw me out? The short answer is maybe, and probably. It's hard to defend a non-payment of rent lawsuit. Now, these are unprecedented times. Judges are human. Are they going to throw out every tenant that doesn't pay rent? Most likely no. Our landlord's going to want to throw you out and have all of this vacant space in their complexes and their buildings and developments? Probably not. That's not what they're looking to do. It's going to drive rents down, and they're probably going to be willing to work with you. But if you want a definitive answer from me as to how can I ensure I'm going to stay in this location and not have the landlord come back to me after the fact for other concessions because I was technically in default, I'm going to advise my clients to pay rent. One of my clients has a location that just crushes it, does better sales than any of their other 30 locations. And they got a notice of default from that location. And they said to me, what should I do? And I told them, well, if you don't want the landlord who knows your sales because you have a gross sales reporting requirement to come back to you in 6 months to a year and say, I'm going to increase your rent because you're in default during the pandemic, then you need to pay your rent. And they had the ability to do it. So for that location, they actually did pay their rent and cured the default. But they can't pay the rent at all their locations. They don't have enough revenue to do that, and certainly not enough government proceeds from the PPP or the such.
Got you. So, I mean, there's a lot of restaurants that are up right now. If your business was designed to be drive-through only or pickup only, and you're like, say, a pizza company, right? Like you make pizza or you do burgers. Like somebody I know in Olympia, Washington is up 40% from this time last year. So like some people are actually, because of this, doing really well. So I think it's pretty cut and dry. If you're doing well, or if you're doing good enough, just pay your rent. Best solution. That's the best way to keep your relationship with your landlord going. Pretty straightforward. I think after this, number one was an easy one. Going forward, the next three solutions are going to be, you can't pay rent and your landlord is willing to work with you. And now we're on to number two of the 9 ways to resolve landlord-tenant relations, and that way is triple net only. What do you mean by that? And
So sure. So landlords have their obligations as well. I mentioned that earlier on in the conversation. So one proposal that we've done with our landlord is we pay our proportionate share of their operating costs, their triple nets, essentially our trash, taxes to the extent they're not abated by the municipality, their mortgage payment. And this actually, in this one location where this worked to everybody's benefit, it turned out that we were paying about 10% of our rent by just covering our carrying costs that they couldn't forbear. Now that landlord was very proactive. They cut costs left and right. Obviously the development was not being operated at full capacity anymore. Their operating expenses went way down. But to be able to take our monthly rent from, call it $30,000 a month to $3,000 a month, and just help carry that operating costs for the landlords so that they could pay what absolutely had to be paid, was a great relief for this one location for my client. And it on the back end of the lease, what they did was they extended the term, and we'll get more into that later, so that everybody gets the essentially the desired effect when they entered into the lease, of the same amount of rent payments that you were expecting to have, in the same amount of months operating.
got you. Now I'm going to throw in a little caveat here. This is not my strong suit. So when you're going, I might be asking a lot of questions, and I might not even know when you're done. There's a lot of vulnerable when you're vulnerable with admitting what you don't know. It kind of opens up the conversation for me to kind of get more out of you. So I mean, does that cover anything? Did you just round off that solution right there? Or
Yeah.
is to it? All right, cool. So the number 3, the third thing that you can do to resolve for relationships with your landlord is security deposits. So how can we use security deposits to resolve the situation?
Sure. So a lot of times when you sign a lease, you pay 2 months security, maybe more, depending upon how much work the landlord's doing for you to fit out the space. And sometimes you also pay some prepaid rents, whether it's first and last month's or just last month's rent. So the landlord should have on its books a good portion of money that is really your money. And one way to kind of push this issue down the road a little bit, and hopefully it resolves in a short period of time, is to ask the landlord if they're willing to apply that security deposit towards your monthly rental obligations, and use the last month rent towards this month's rent. Um, that may allow you to buy 2, 3, maybe 4 months worth of time before you're technically in default, before the landlord loses anything. Now, that isn't really a share the pain type mentality. In that situation, the landlord is still whole. And I think for this really to work out in everybody's best interest, or at least the restaurateur's best interest, the landlord's going to need to feel a little bit of the pain. And that's where we get into the next couple of solutions. So just applying security deposits and prepaid rents, that doesn't really help the tenant too much, other than just delaying their financial obligations, keeping them out of default for the time being, but they're still paying every penny on the dollar that's due under the lease obligation. So it's not a huge help. It just buys them time.
Again, cool. So again, real quick, just to give you guys, to catch you up, we're on number 3. Number 1 was just pay the rent if you can. Number 2 was use triple net. And number 3 is security deposits. And these are solutions if you've been proactive, if you were smart enough to put these things into play beforehand, right? They're options to you now is kind of how I'm hearing this come out of your mouth. And going forward, the next 2 options are going to be maybe if you weren't really planning ahead, and now the landlord is willing to take some of the burden to help you out. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, that's right. That's
Okay.
right. So this is more of nobody taking advantage of the situation and everybody working together to come to a solution.
Got you. So number 4 is the next one we're gonna cover, which is abatement. So get into abatement and how that could be a solution for us.
Sure. So some landlords are proposing that they just abate rent for the time being while you're closed because of the government regulations and the such. So,
I'm gonna
for
be
example,
I'm gonna show my vulnerability again. When you say the word abatement, we hear it come up a lot in legal talk, but what exactly does that mean?
it just means that you don't have to pay the rent right now, but in this scenario, they're going to ask you to pay it in the future.
Gotcha.
So they may say for the next 2 months, you don't have to pay me rent, but starting in January of 2021, you're going to pay me extra rent every month until you repay me those 2 months that I abated during this time.
Okay.
So again, this isn't so much of the landlord taking a hit again. It's just delaying when they get their money. It's not a great solution for the restaurateurs because you still have to come out of pocket and pay it at some point, albeit not now. And hopefully your sales are good enough when you come back that it'll work. But it's not a great solution. And in some instances that I've seen, it's really like a slap in the face. After we sent out our initial letter to the landlords, one of them got back to us, and this was in April, and they said, okay, we'll abate half of April month's rent, and May's rent is due immediately, and you can repay us that April rent in June. And the restaurateur pretty much just said, you got to be kidding me. How's that help? I got to still pay you half my rent, and I was just shut down, and then I got to repay you it in June, and I may still be shut down in June. Who knows what's going to happen? So this scenario, although it could be helpful for some operators, it could also really be detrimental to the landlord-tenant partnership that we're trying to preserve here.
Yeah, and it's important to point out too that, like, say your landlord's been super good at working with you, finding solutions, and they're saying, okay, well, we'll make April, May, June, and July free, right? And then you can start paying us back at, like, we'll throw in an additional 30%, to, like, until you're paid in full. But you got to keep in mind that when we start opening, we're not going to be in business at full capacity. So, we might not even be able to make our original rent with where the cash flow we have coming in. So you really got to be careful and realistic with what you're agreeing to. Do you want to reflect on that?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it kind of leads me into the last item that you and I discussed before the call, which is number 5, right, is the forbearance option. Landlords could just say, don't pay me until you're back up and running at full capacity. And then at the end of the term, extend the term for that period of time. So let's say it takes 6 months for you to get back up and running at 100%. If they were to forbear their rent for 6 months, and then at the end of the term, let's say your term expired in January of 2022, if they just extended it to July 2022, then they would get those 6 payments at the end of the term, something that they weren't expecting to get anyways. Another potential solution, which we didn't discuss, is turning the rent into a straight percentage rent deal until you're back up and running at full capacity. If you just pay,
sorry, keep going.
If you just pay a percentage of your gross sales to the landlord until your revenues return to what they were pre-pandemic, then that could also help you to share the pain. Like I said, I think the common theme is nobody should take advantage of the situation, but if we're going to work together to resolve this and stay in business together and keep this partnership going, everybody's got to feel the pain a little bit. And a percentage rent deal actually helps with the restaurateur because it allows them to just pay what they can afford to pay once they crunch their numbers and tell the landlord what percentage rent they're comfortable paying until their sales return.
Yeah. So just to summarize up to this point, we've covered 5 of the 9 items we're going to be going over. The first one is pay your rent, obviously. Second one, triple net. Third, security deposits. Fourth, abatement. 5, forbearance, and then you just kind of threw in a bonus option there, which is a percentage rent deal, work out some type of percentage. And before we take our next break to thank our sponsors, I kind of want to just break something down real quick. Up to this point, we've been talking about your landlord's willing to work with you, right? Where are, in the scenario where landlords are not willing to work with their tenants, what planet do they live on where they think they're going to be able to find new tenants to go into the space? And like, what does that conversation look like if our landlord is thinking that they can find new people to go into the space? Like how do we get realistic around that conversation? Like what's people out if you can't find anybody to go back in there? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that is some of the restaurateurs' leverage. Some of the tenants' leverage is that the landlords are going to find it hard to replace you, and certainly once they put it back on the market, there's going to be a lot of vacant spaces, a lot of failed restaurants. There's going to be a lot of choices for those new operators that want to get into the business in the next 6 months to a year once this all once the pandemic resolves itself. But so that is some leverage that you have in order to get the landlord to be more reasonable. And then there's a couple of other things that, depending on the language in your lease, you could also hit on to push some buttons with the landlord.
which is the next 4 items we're going to get into.
That's right. So, and I think the biggest issue that that tenants have in trying to figure this out, and quite frankly, landlords too, is nobody knows how long this is going to take. Nobody knows when things are going to be back to normal, to pre-pandemic sales and revenues, when tenants are going to be able to afford the rent that they agreed to, and when landlords can expect to get back to normal as well.
For up to this point, we covered, if you're in a good situation, you can pay your rent, just do it. Now you're in the second scenario is your landlord's willing to work with you. The next 4 of these scenarios, your landlord is not willing to work with you. This is what you can do. These are the things you should be looking at. Correct?
Yeah, these are options for you to consider and try to get you some leverage to try to get your landlord to work with you.
Okay, so number 6, condemnation provisions. Get into it.
Sure. So every lease is different. So it's really important to look at the exact language in the lease. But every lease will have a condemnation provision. And it's important to note that that restaurant operators were not shut down because of the virus. They were shut down because the government told us to shut down. Now, I think a lot of operators would have shut down whether the government told them to or not. But luckily, the government did tell us to. So that, in essence, could be considered a regulatory taking. So you no longer have the right to operate in the premises because the government told you can't do it. And that's essentially what a condemnation is. Now, obviously, unprecedented times, this has never been litigated before. Who knows what a court is going to decide? But if you were to argue in court that you're not in default because the government told you can't operate and it's a temporary condemnation, that you shouldn't have to pay rent, because almost every lease has a condemnation provision that says that if there's a taking by the government of the premises, you don't have to pay rent anymore, then that's some leverage for a tenant to use to try to get their landlord to be reasonable. And for those landlords that have a national footprint, it's a very strong argument, a very scary argument, because if it's adopted in one jurisdiction, then it's likely to be adopted in other jurisdictions. And if it ever gets litigated, it could impact hundreds of properties for national landlords.
Got you. Beautiful. Okay, so that was condemnation provisions. Anything else to unpack regarding that before we move on to number 7?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. Just a rent abatement based on the amount of square footage you're able to use, and in a lot of our leases we negotiate it's based on a lost sales. So I guess I did have a little bit more to unpack there for you. I apologize, but so it's proportionate.
I don't know when you're done. I don't know if there's
neither do I. So if your lease is like ours, where the condemnation and the casualty provisions are tied to our prior sales, where my operators are doing 10% of what they normally did, now their rent obligations will go down to 10%.
Got you. Okay, so I think we can sew that one up. On to number 7, which is environmental provisions. Get into it.
So this is a pretty novel one, and I discussed it with some of our litigation partners, and there are issues with the argument, but nonetheless, it is something that you could throw at the wall and see if it sticks. And as they've said to me, judges are human, and if these cases end up in front of a judge, they're going to know what was happening, and are they going to like the landlord trying to throw you out? So the environmental provision, depending on the language in your lease, could say that if there is a contaminant in the premises that causes you to be unable to operate, that your rent should abate. Again, you don't have to pay rent if there's a contaminant in your space. So if the language is favorable in your environmental provision, and I've seen a lot of leases where it is, you could take the position that the virus is a contaminant, that we've been told by the government we can't operate because of that contaminant, and now our rent should not have to be paid because the environmental provision says that our rent will abate if we're unable to operate because of a contaminant within our premises.
Okay. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of these things, like these provisions, the condemnation, the environmental provisions, would have had to been in your lease agreement to begin with, correct?
Yeah, all of these provisions would have needed to been in your lease. There are what we call common law defenses and provisions, such as frustration of purpose and impossibility, which is essentially similar types of arguments where you can no longer operate because it's impossible because the government told you you can't operate, or the purpose of the lease was to operate a restaurant, and we've been told that we can't operate a restaurant here. So the purpose of the lease was frustrated. And those common law remedies don't have to be in the lease. However, the specific provisions for condemnation and eminent domain in the next couple that we're about to discuss, you have to look at those the wording in each lease, because every provision is different. Even those where we have the same landlord in multiple locations, sometimes they have different attorneys negotiating for the landlord, so the documents look a little bit differently, and every word matters.
Yeah, and I think it was David Denny. I believe I recorded an interview with David Denny out of Dallas, all about lease negotiation and how to do that, and provisions that should be in your lease agreement. So I'll link to that episode. And while we're going through this stuff, if these provisions are not in your lease, these are the things you should be making note of. So going into the future, you can evolve and adapt and get better as a business owner, because this stuff isn't just pertinent to right now. This is stuff that should be in your agreements, your rent agreements, going into the future, your lease agreements going into the future as well. Just wanted to point that out. Thank you for summarizing that. So can we wrap up the environmental provision?
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point of these lease provisions that you need to make sure are in your lease, for our clients, I probably got a 25-page document with our standard provisions in that we put into every single lease that we get. I'm sorry?
Is that a punch list of forms? Going through this stuff?
It's just all different provisions, such as the force majeure provision that we're about to talk about, the environmental provision that we just talked about, so that they're somewhat standard in all of our leases and have been approved by our boards and such. So to make sure that the tenant is as protected as possible. And even that being said, nobody ever saw this pandemic coming. So even in the best, most tenant-friendly leases out there's still a lot of unknowns as to how this is all going to play out.
All right, number 8, we're almost at the end of the list. Landlord defaults. What do you mean by that?
Sure. So the landlord represents and warrants certain things in every single lease. One is the right to quiet enjoyment. So quiet enjoyment means that you have the right to use your property for the permitted use without interference or hindrance. So depending upon the language of that provision, you may be able to tell the landlord that they're in default under the right of quiet enjoyment. Another provision that we've seen in a lot of our leases is a covenant that the permitted use to operate as a restaurant is permitted by applicable law. Well, right now it's not permitted by applicable law. The governors have all said you can't operate as a restaurant. So those covenants that the landlord, those representations that they've made, they are now not accurate. So you can put the landlord on notice that they're in default, again, to try to get some leverage. They may utilize the force majeure provision that we're about to discuss to say that they don't have to comply with that. But again, when you're fighting back with the landlord at this time, my goal is really just to throw mud at the wall and see what sticks, right? And to try to get them to be more reasonable and negotiate with us a resolution that works for both parties. So I think anything you can throw at them helps.
Got you. And then the last item we're going to cover, and again, these last four that we've gone through, the condemnation provision, environmental provision, and landlord defaults, are if your landlord are not willing to work with you. The last one is force majeure, and I'm sorry if I didn't say that right. You should try to hear me say French restaurants when I'm introducing my guests, Italian restaurants. My last name's Cacciatore, and I cannot spit out. My ancestors are rolling in their graves, so I'll just say that. But how do you say it? Force majeure? Say it one more time.
Force majeure.
So what do you mean by that?
So that's essentially the act of God provision. So almost every contract, and if it's not in the contract, most common law in most states allow for relief from contractual obligations if there's something that's outside of the control of the party to perform. So an act of God or a pandemic. So the issue with the force majeure provisions is that most of them, I'd say 90% of them, carve out the obligation to pay rent. So they say, if you can't perform under this contract because of an act of God, then you're not in default, unless it's because you're not paying rent. You always have to pay rent. So that doesn't really help with the non-payment of rent, but it does help with the covenant to continuously operate. It does help with construction obligations and timelines if you're building out your restaurant during this pandemic and things have slowed down. And arguably, it could help to extend the rent commencement date. A lot of our deals, we get 6 months or more to build out our restaurants without paying rent. If we're delayed because of this, there's an argument to be made that because of the force majeure provision that the rent commencement date should be pushed out because of that. Now, again, the only way to get any, to be confident that any interpretation of your lease is going to be correct is to go to court and have a judge tell you that it's correct. But if you're just trying to get some leverage to discuss a reasonable solution with your landlord and communicate with your landlord, a lot of these arguments can put a little bit of fear in them that if you're right, then it could impact them with the rest of their tenants and the rest of their properties. Again, if it's a national landlord, properties throughout the country.
All right, beautiful. So I think that's it. Those are the 9 items we're going to go over again. I'll summarize. These are the 9 strategies to resolve landlord-tenant relations during COVID-19. Number 1, pay your rent if you can. Don't be a slime ball. Pay your rent. Number 2, triple net only. Number 3, security deposits. Number 4, abatement. Number 5, forbearing rent extending terms. Those are if your landlord's willing to work with you, and if your landlord is not willing to work with you, condemnation provision, environmental provision, landlord default, and force majeure. I think I said it right that time. Anything that it has popped into your head just through talking? I know when I talk, sometimes new thoughts come to my head that you want to share with us before we wrap up.
No, I think we're good. I think what I really hope is that we get through this crisis sooner than later, and that we can get back to negotiating new leases for new restaurants all over the country, as opposed to talking about existing locations that are having problems because sales have just dropped so drastically.
Maybe we'll wrap up with that question. I know that you have written and spoke about the future of the industry. So you like to project what the future looks like. What do you see the future of the industry? Let's say a year from today. What do you see? How does the industry look in your eyes?
I think a lot of the larger operators are obviously they're going to survive. I believe the smaller operators, the mom and pop restaurants, the 1, 2, 3 units, are going to have a really tough time unless some more restaurant oriented governmental relief is passed by the legislation. Um, and restaurants aren't going anywhere. I read someplace that without restaurants, our supermarkets would run out of food in a very short period of time. So the industry isn't going anywhere. Unfortunately, some of your favorite restaurants may end up failing and going away. So I do think you need to support the restaurants that you love as much as possible right now, ordering takeout, buying gift cards. I know one of our clients is very concerned about their employees. Bar Taco restaurant, they actually had a program going where if you bought gift cards, it went into a fund that was geared towards giving back to their employees and helping them through these tough times too. So I think in a year, I'm hopeful that we're back up at 100% occupation or occupancy, and all the restaurants are doing great again. But I think there's going to be a lot of new restaurants, and I also think there's going to be a lot of good deals out there for new restaurant operators and those looking to expand.
Yeah. What about the landscape of the industry? I think I agree with you 100% that there's going to be a ton of opportunity on the table. And what I hope I communicate during this time is that we get to kind of break the mold. And we're learning so much about just self-awareness and being proactive instead of reactive. And we get to choose to come back stronger. And there's been a lot of people that have voiced their opinion on like what's wrong with our industry. And I think that because we're all being forced to pause right now, we have some time to reflect and to choose how we come back as an industry collectively. What are some of the changes you'd like to see? I'm curious.
Um, Changes I'd like to see. You know, I don't see any. I don't see the need for a lot of changes. I love the restaurant industry. I mean, my wife and I were foodies. We love going. We kind of gear our vacations away from the kids on going to popular foodie towns. We went to Portland last summer for a week and ate our way through Portland, Maine. I think we just need to get back to business as usual, and let the operators do what they do best, which is bring the good ones bring a great ambiance and they bring you great food, and there's nothing better than going in, sitting down, having great service, great food, a couple of cocktails, and enjoying time with whoever you're with. I don't think things need to change. I think the good operators have great relationships with their partners, and hopefully the landlords see their operators as their partners, and that they get through this together, because without a little landlord assistance, a lot of restaurants are going to fail. And then the landlords are going to have to go out and find new ones, and hopefully they're as good as the ones that are currently around.
Eric, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. We wrap up every chat by calling somebody out. So who's one restaurant operator, somebody that you respect and admire and just think is doing it right? Call them out to be a featured guest on the show.
Sure. Caleb Harrell at Hawkers out of Florida. It's Hawkers Asian Street Fair. If you follow them on their social media, I think they've been doing everything right. Great operation, great food, good ambiance. I already mentioned Bar Taco, and they're run up by Scott Lawton right now, and they're doing great things too. Check them out on social media, and you can see how they're doing things right during this time, when there's no playbook. And it's certainly worth getting as a guest.
What was the first name you dropped on me? Hawker?
Caleb Harrell and Hawkers Asian Street Fair. They're based out of Florida, and they're expanding up the East Coast.
That was Caleb and Scott. Look out, guys. I'm coming after you. I'd love to get you on the show. And how can we connect with you? Any final words, anything we should be aware of, anything that your law firm's putting out that would be helpful for us? Now's your time to let us know.
Sure. Our website, halloransage.com. is a great resource. We've got client alerts about all areas of the COVID-19 crisis. We've got 100 lawyers who focus on every aspect that you would need as a business owner, from employment to insurance to litigation and transactions, obviously. So you can sign up for our client alerts, and we can certainly get you some additional information if you need it through that. And then my LinkedIn page is, I try to keep current with some good articles, blogs, and information that is on point with my restaurant practice.
This is episode 714. If you head over to restaurantunstoppable.com/714, I'll summarize today's discussion as well as linking to any tools or resources mentioned and how to connect with Eric over there. Eric Bernheim, there is no questioning. You are unstoppable. Thank you so much.
Thanks, buddy. It was great.
If you enjoyed this video, please help us out. You can do it by liking, sharing, subscribing, and hitting that bell icon. It really helps out. And don't forget, there's a complete archive of every episode with show notes at restaurantunstoppable.com.